The first few verses of this chapter contain some information that is among the most mysterious and troubling in the entire Old Testament. It concerns the statement that the sons of God saw the daughters of men and that they were attractive. So they took them as wives. And the children born from these unions were different, as were their fathers, these sons of God, different. Now, sons of God in Hebrew is B'nai Elohim. And we're going to see other references to these mysterious B'nai Elohim in later parts of the Bible. We're going to talk about this more momentarily, but just know for now that I think these were some type of high-ranking spiritual beings. They would not necessarily be classified as angels. We are told that the B'nai Elohim were given charge over all the nations of the earth. And we run into one of these B'nai Elohim, who is also called the Prince of Persia in the book of Daniel. But the Bible also gives us a special name for the offspring of these now hybrid people, and that name is Nephilim. Now, the King James Bible and many other Bible translations have translated Nephilim to mean giants, like fee-fi-fo-fum, giants. It was the Greek Septuagint, developed in about 250 BC, who first took the tact that these people were giants. This is because the writers of the Septuagint took the Hebrew word Nephilim and translated it to the Greek word gigante. In Hebrew, however, Nephilim is a play on the root word nephal, which means fallen or to fall upon. In the Hebrew, it has no sense, no indication of something being freakishly large. Rather, the sense of the word is to cease or to die, or to be cast down into the earth, like into a grave. It was even used to describe an abortion, and in other cases indicated something that was dead and rotting. Martin Luther described the nature of the Nephilim as men of violence, tyrants. Now, for lack of a better way to put it, the Nephilim were a race of something different, apart from anything else, and it was an evil kind of difference. It is as though the Nephilim were some type of mutants, or they were an aberration that became endowed with much power. They represented a joining together of the worst of the spiritual world with the worst of the physical world. Well, now back to our discussion about who these verses are referring to when it talks of these sons of God. Many Bible scholars have taken this to mean fallen angels. Now, it's easy to see how that conclusion could be arrived at when fallen or cast down is one sense of the word Nephilim. Add to that the heavenly or spiritual sense of sons of God, that phrase, and the idea is formed that some fallen angels took on a human male form, complete with reproductive organs apparently, mated with human women, with the result being a race of giants called Nephilim. The ancient Hebrews certainly never even dreamed of this meeting. Rather, they saw it that the sons of God was simply a designation for the line of Seth, the line of faithful, godly men. Conversely, the women, called daughters of men, were representatives of the line of Cain, those who fell away from God. And according to the ancient Hebrew sages up to this time, the faithful line of Seth had stayed separate from the wicked line of Cain, but eventually some men from the line of Seth lusted after these beautiful women from the line of Cain, and there went the neighborhood. Now the whole human race was fouled and polluted with evil. Well, this separation and division in the line of Cain from the line of Seth is seen by the Hebrew sages as a type. In other words, it's another of these underlying fundamental principles that we see played out over and over again in the Bible. A long time into the future, when God would take the Israelites out of Egypt and give them the Torah, which we are in the midst of studying, he did so with the instruction to be ye separated. He separated Israel away from all other peoples of the world to be a nation of priests to him, to be a faithful people to God. All the other peoples of the world, everyone other than the Israelites, were given a title, Goyim, Gentiles. The Israelites were a people holy to God, everybody else wasn't. And this is how it was for the line of Cain versus the line of Seth long before the Israelites ever existed. Now, in any case, whether the Nephilim were the result of mixing of two lines of humans or the mixing of humans with spiritual beings, the result of all this was that a race of people called Nephilim bedeviled everybody, and they were able at times to dominate at will. Apparently they were bigger, stronger, smarter. Probably they were the subjects of the ancient pagan myths and legends of great and fierce warriors and leaders who seemed to have almost superhuman qualities. Were they actually giants, like in the movies? Only by the most vague suggestion. So what were the Nephilim in reality? We really don't know for sure. But more and more scholars are coming to the conclusion that likely these were people who in one way or another turned themselves over to Satan, and they gained great power in the doing. When we read in the scriptures designations of the Antichrist and how this person will be incredibly charismatic, perhaps the most intelligent man ever to live, cunning, one step ahead of everybody, then we find out it's Satan who is his source of power. I have no doubt that Satan has been the source of power for many a world dictator. Hitler convinced an entire nation that, by the way, generally identifies itself as a Christian nation. Hard to believe. That it was their duty to rule the world and to rid it of the Jews, the Christ killers, as he commonly labeled them. He confounded the world with his abilities, with his battle strategies. And we were within an eyelash of seeing him realize his evil dream. I have a feeling that Hitler could well be categorized as a type of modern day Nephilim. No matter where the Nephilim existence came from, whether they came from fallen sons of God, Benai Elohim, or from fallen man, the true source of their power was evil, and even the coming flood wouldn't be the end of it. I think we're going to eventually see that while the Nephilim were literal and real, they also came to represent a type. That is, before the flood, they were very likely a real race of people. But after the flood, when they were wiped out, Nephilim and the other names for them might have been but other peoples that were thought to have very similar attributes. We're going to see later on in Genesis after the great flood, and then again in the book of Numbers, and eventually even in the book of Deuteronomy, that the Nephilim or Nephilim-like people are again mentioned. These post-flood types of Nephilim are given a number of names, including the Rephaim, the Emim, the Anakim, the Horim, and a few more. And when we get to those biblical sections, I'll point it out to you. And by the way, the giant, Goliath, who was slain by David, was of the Anakim, because Goliath was from Gath, reported to be a village where the Anakim ruled. We'll find that in Joshua chapter 11. It's interesting that the Anakim and the Philistines occupied the same territory. But we must also understand that, as happens with men, as time passes, a reality can become distorted. It can be turned into a legend. The language of the Bible is not immune to that phenomenon. Because even though the Bible is divine truth, it is still told through the lives and events of real people. And it is told with the flaws and the misconceptions and all. So I suspect that in episodes we read in the scriptures that took place hundreds of years after the original race of the Nephilim died out, that the name for these strange beings was used as a general term to describe someone or some group of people who had certain characteristics that were deemed evil, or maybe they were physically larger than others and therefore menacing, or they were the fiercest warriors or some such thing. For example, even in Christ's day, long after the Canaanites of old were gone, the term Canaanite was still in use. That is, while no living Israelite even knew a Canaanite, it was common memory among the Jewish people that the Canaanites of old were idol worshipers and they were child sacrificers. Everything that Israel detested. So Canaanite came to be used as a cuss word, so to speak. You Canaanite. Usually referring to a person you didn't approve of. Often, it was in reference to a merchant who cheated somebody, maybe to a man who didn't practice his Judaism to the satisfaction of some of the more pious folks. You know, when I was a younger man, I recall a person being called a communist if you didn't like him. It was not really about them actually belonging to the Communist Party. It was just kind of a politically correct four-letter word for the day. And since communism was public enemy number one all throughout the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, so on, with McCarthyism and the Korean War, Vietnam, to call somebody a communist was just a derogatory term and a label nobody wanted. But let me emphatically state that many of the sages and rabbis wove the legends of the Nephilim into their traditions, particularly the traditions concerning angels and the world of evil spirits. So as far as they were concerned, these Nephilim were not only real before the flood, but also after. So who and what they were was to always be taken in the most literal and real sense, not taken as types or epithets.